Let's talk about writing a science fiction short story, and let's use Vaster Than Empires in More Slow by Ursula Le Guin as our example story that we can use to discuss. So, when we think about writing a short story, whether it's science fiction, literary fiction, or any other genre of fiction, the thing to remember is that your readers are there primarily to meet your characters. The premise of your story is important. The science and how you use it as the foundation of your story matters. How original or unique your story is can vary. But the thing that all stories need is a character or characters that the audience can meet and engage with. So in Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, we have the crew of the spaceship The Gum. The captain is Tomiko, and the main character who causes the conflict that the other characters encounter is Osden. Now we also have Manon and Harfex and Olaru and Esquana. These characters are sort of peripheral to the main two characters, who are Osden and Tomiko. So there's two ways of thinking about Vaster Than Empires as a science fiction story. If we start with the plot and the premise, it's a story about people that get on a ship and go to a planet that looks like it just has plants on it, only to discover that it has, life that can think. That is an important premise to the story, but the characters who are going to enact this premise are what make the story more interesting. So maybe I'll bring this point out by offering something of a counterpoint. There's a famous and really good, not criticizing, but really good story by Arthur C. Clarke called Rendezvous with Rama. In Rendezvous with Rama, there's a spaceship that's passing through our solar system, and a crew of scientists and astronauts go to investigate this spaceship. Once they get inside, they realize it's a huge cylinder and that it's like a world in the interior of this spaceship. There's nothing living in it now, but of course they are wondering what might have lived in it or what might be sleeping in it only to be resurrected. There's all these ways in which these characters encounter the spaceship and learn about it. But I will say, and the reason why I'm using this for a comparison is I can't tell you any of the characters in that story. There's a captain. There's some people on the ship. I like that story. I've read it a couple times, but I still can't tell you who the characters were. The characters in Rendezvous with Rama are there to show us what Arthur C. Clarke thinks an alien spaceship would be like. It doesn't mean that it's a bad story, but if we compare it to Vaster Than Empires, the plot of Vaster Than Empires is very simple. Let's go explore a new planet. We're like surveyors. We're a surveying crew to go to world 4470. The thing that makes that story so interesting is that Osden, the main character, was someone who was born with autism and through some sort of a developmental program had his autism reversed so that instead of lacking empathy, he is overwhelmed with a sense of empathy that he can never turn off. And the other characters need to understand what's going on in terms of the planet, but also their interpersonal conflicts. What does it mean to have someone who, when you think badly about them, knows it and holds it against you? That's really the point of Vaster Than Empires. It's not so much about surveying the planet or the planet being alive or whatever. It's really about the interpersonal relationships between these characters. And we might think the turning point of the story is, they figure out the planet is alive. I think the turning point of the story is when Tomiko understands something about Osden, when Tomiko gets an insight into Osden's mind. So what can we do with this sort of brief look at Vaster Than Empires, the brief comparison to Rendezvous with Rama? Well, if you're trying to think of your science fiction story, there's a chance that you're going to come up with a premise that is very, very large, because part of the thing about writing science fiction is you need some backstory. You need something to explain why your world is different than the world that we live in. So Ursula Le Guin just hints at this, but actually throughout all of her novels, starting with Rockinon's World and ending with I think the Dispossessed was the last one she wrote in this series, they all take place in a universe called the Hainish cycle. Hain is a planet. It's the original birthplace of humanity. Earth, or Terra as it's called, is just one of many planets that were colonized by Hain. And in Vaster Than Empires, the crew of the Gum actually come from a number of different planets, including Earth and Hain. But I think there's at least one other planet represented there too. We don't need to know everything about how Hain colonized the planets, how Hain contacted the planets. We don't need to know what the relationships are between Hain and the other planets in the Hainish system. We just need to know that this is an interplanetary group of explorers and that they are going to explore a planet. So if you have a very large premise for your story, like there's been a nuclear war, you don't need to tell us the whole history of that nuclear war. Just that your characters are in a space, a setting, that's been destroyed by nuclear war is enough. So you don't need to say, oh, this country fought with that country and this one started first, whatever. Your story takes place after the nuclear war. So just pick up after that happened and start explaining what the world your characters live in is like. Next, you need really good characters, or at least one good character. A story really only needs one character that the audience has to relate to. We each go through life primarily as individuals. We're surrounded by other people, but the inside of our mind is always the inside of our own mind. We're not going around thinking for one another, though that is an interesting premise for a science fiction story. And so a reader will connect to your story by connecting through your character. If you have a great idea, but there's not really any characters in the story, it won't really feel like a story. Think of a story this way. A story is something that starts and stops. It doesn't have to begin and end. You know, your characters presumably existed before the story opens, and they, unless they die in the story, will exist past the end of the story. And so your story just needs a frame. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's a week. For a short story, I would strongly suggest that you keep your frame small. Is it an hour? Is it an afternoon? Is it one day? Is it several days? Is it a week? If you limit the frame of how long your story can go on for, you can still write something that's very long by adding a lot of detail. But you won't end up writing some kind of a thing that should be a novel and trying to cram it into 10 pages or 5 pages or 15 pages or whatever the length of your short story is. If you want to write something longer, that's cool someday. Not necessarily for my science fiction course that you're taking. But for us, if we think about a short story as something that takes place within a limited period of time, and the focus is on a character's learning experience within that period of time. So, Vaster Than Empires, Tomiko learns what makes Osden tick. She learns how his mind works. Now, the crew also learns that the planet is cognizant, that the planet is sentient, but we don't really even understand that much about the sentience of the planet. We just know that Osden can connect with it, and that teaches us something about Osden. Because learning about Osden is more important to us as the reader than learning about World 4470. The crew of the Gum, they're there to learn about World 4470. We are there, we are watching to learn about the crew of the Gum. We're there to learn about Osden, we're there to learn about Tomiko and Harfex and the others and how they relate. So, to just summarize what I've said briefly, when you're writing a science fiction story, you can come up with a huge idea, but it doesn't all need to be in the story. The Hainish cycle for Ursula Le Guin spanned many short stories and novels. It spanned decades of her writing. So you can have a big idea, but the story can be one microcosm. It can be one part of that big idea. You don't need to explain everything in terms of history. Next, limit the scope of your setting. Limit it to a couple days, a week, a few hours, something where your characters can pace themselves within a period of time. It'll help you keep your story concise. And finally, your characters are most important and they need a learning experience. Your characters are the element of the story that your readers will primarily connect with. They're the part that the readers primarily care about. So those are my 3 pieces of advice as you're working on your story. Keep it short by limiting the time, not trying to put everything in it even if your premise is large, and focusing on the characters, making sure those characters have some sort of a learning experience or change within the story. I hope that helps. I am looking forward to reading what you write.